Welcome to Sleepscape. If you enjoy this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. If there's a story that you'd like for me to tell, feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. In 1988, a 23-year-old single mother named Jackie Hernandez moved into a small rented bungalow on West 11th Street in San Pedro, California, hoping it would serve as a fresh start during one of the most difficult periods of her life. At the time, Jackie was pregnant, working multiple jobs, attending school part-time, and going through a stressful divorce. Financially, her options were limited. The house she rented wasn't ideal, but it was affordable, and more importantly, it was available. The neighborhood itself was quiet, a working-class area with modest homes and little reason to draw attention. The bungalow looked like any other house on the street. Single story, simple layout, small yard, and an attic space above the kitchen. For Jackie, it wasn't about comfort. It was about stability. For the first time, everything seemed normal. Then, small things began to happen. Objects would go missing and later reappear in different locations. Items she was certain she had just set down would no longer be where she left them. Occasionally, she would hear faint knocking sounds, subtle at first, like something tapping from inside the walls. There were also smells. Not constant, but intermittent. A sour, unpleasant odor that would drift through certain rooms and then disappear just as quickly. At times, it seemed strongest near the kitchen, though there was never an obvious source. Given the stress she was under, Jackie initially dismissed these experiences. Lack of sleep, emotional strain, and the demands of daily life provided a reasonable explanation. But over time, the frequency increased. The noises became more distinct, the misplaced objects became harder to rationalize, and the overall feeling inside the house began to change. Jackie later described it as a constant awareness that she wasn't alone. Not in a vague sense, but something more immediate, as if something was always just behind her, watching. The moment that changed everything came one evening while she was sitting in her living room. From where she was sitting, she could partially see into the hallway. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A pencil holder sitting on a table had lifted into the air. It didn't tip over or slide. It lifted. For a brief moment, it hovered. Then it moved. Fast. The object shot down the hallway toward her with enough force to make it clear this wasn't accidental. Startled, Jackie grabbed her son and ran out of the house. She went to a neighbor's home and called the police, hoping for some kind of explanation. When the officers arrived, they found nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no damage that couldn't be explained. To them, it was a misunderstanding. But for Jackie, it marked a clear shift. Something inside that house had just acted with intent. In the days that followed, others began to experience similar events. Her neighbor, Susan Castaneda, later described hearing a loud crash in another room while visiting. When they went to investigate, they found that a painting had fallen, but not beneath where it had been hanging. It had landed several feet away, as if it had been thrown. On another occasion, Susan reported seeing a lamp move across a room before dropping. It didn't tip over or fall down, it was moving. At that point, the activity could no longer be explained as stress or imagination. Multiple people were witnessing the same thing. Over time, the activity escalated. After the birth of her second child, the situation intensified significantly. What had once been minor disturbances became more aggressive and unpredictable. One night, Jackie noticed a dark liquid seeping from the ceiling and running down the walls of her kitchen. The substance was thick, heavy, and deep in color. It resembled blood. Concerned about a leak, she climbed onto a washing machine to reach the attic hatch. The opening was small, forcing her to lift herself carefully to look inside. As she pushed the hatch open and looked into the darkness, her eyes adjusted just enough to make out shapes. That's when she saw it. A human head, floating in the corner of the attic, detached, motionless at first, staring directly at her. Within seconds, it moved rapidly toward her. Startled, Jackie fell backward into the kitchen, hitting the floor and breaking down in panic. She refused to enter the attic again, but whatever she had seen did not remain confined to that space. Not long after, she reported seeing a full figure inside her children's room. She described an elderly man with gray, sunken skin, wearing a red flannel vest. The figure was sitting on a bed, watching her. The detail that stood out most to her was the eyes. Red, focused. Moments later, the figure disappeared. At that point, Jackie sought outside help. She contacted Barry Taft, a parapsychologist known for investigating thousands of reported hauntings over the course of his career. Taft agreed to visit the home with his team. When they arrived, they immediately noticed a strong, unpleasant odor throughout the house. It seemed to be coming from the attic. They also reported hearing heavy movement above them, not faint noises, distinct sounds as if something large was moving through the space. Two members of the team entered the attic to investigate. Inside, visibility was extremely limited. Using a camera flash to briefly illuminate the area, they attempted to document what they were experiencing. During this process, one of them reported that the camera was suddenly pulled from his hands and thrown across the attic. The force was strong enough to separate parts of the equipment. They exited shortly afterward. The situation continued to escalate. Jackie later reported that objects were being thrown throughout the house, aggressively. She also described being physically attacked, grabbed and restrained by something she couldn't see. In one incident, she claimed she was held down and unable to breathe. When Taft's team returned, they again entered the attic. During this visit, one of the investigators suddenly began shouting. A cord had wrapped tightly around his neck, pinning him against a wooden beam. Although he remained conscious, he required assistance to free himself. No one present could explain how the cord had moved or tightened. Following this incident, the team ended their investigation at the property. Shortly afterward, Jackie made the decision to leave. She relocated hundreds of miles north, hoping distance would put an end to the events. For a brief time it did. The activity stopped. The house was gone. The experiences faded. Then they returned. Months later, Jackie began reporting similar occurrences in her new home. Scratching sounds, unexplained movement, lights appearing without a clear source. In one incident, her daughter's bed caught fire after Jackie reported seeing a dark mist moving through the hallway. Neighbors in the area also claimed to witness unusual events, including reflections of a man's face appearing in unexpected places. At that point, it became difficult to argue that the phenomenon was tied to a single location. It appeared to be following her. When Jackie first contacted Barry Taff, this wasn't the first time he had seen a case like this. Years earlier, he had investigated the Doris Bither case, another California case involving a single mother who claimed her home was being overtaken by an unseen force. Like Jackie, Doris Bither reported objects moving, unexplained noises, and physical attacks. Investigators documented strange activity inside the home, including objects reportedly moving on their own and unexplained light phenomena appearing in multiple rooms. As with the San Pedro case, the evidence was inconsistent. Photographs failed to clearly capture what witnesses claimed to see, and much of the documentation relied on personal testimony. But there was another similarity that stood out. Doris, like Jackie, was under extreme personal stress. Her life was unstable, and the activity escalated during that period. Over time, Taft began to notice a pattern. Many of the most intense cases he investigated didn't center around locations. They centered around individuals. Specifically, individuals experiencing high levels of emotional or psychological strain. Some researchers have suggested that in certain cases, poltergeist activity may not originate from an external entity at all. Instead, it may be produced by the individual experiencing it. Not intentionally, not consciously, but as a form of psychological release that manifests physically. If that theory holds any truth, it changes how cases like this are understood, because it would mean the source of the disturbance wasn't the house. It was something connected to the person living inside it. Eventually, Jackie moved again, and this time, the activity stopped completely. To this day, the events surrounding the San Pedro house remain heavily debated. Some believe the case represents the most extreme examples of poltergeist activity ever reported. Others point to the lack of definitive physical evidence, inconsistencies in the timeline, and the absence of clear documentation as reasons to question its validity. But regardless of where the truth lies, one detail stands out. The activity began during one of the most unstable periods of Jackie's life, and as her circumstances improved, it disappeared. Which raises a question that has yet to be answered. Was something haunting that house? Or was something being created within it? In 1974, a woman named Doris Bither was living with her children in a small, rundown house on Braddock Street in Culver City, California. The home itself was in poor condition, reportedly condemned by the city more than once, yet it was still being occupied. It wasn't a place most people would choose to live, but for Doris, it was what she could afford. At the time, she was raising multiple children on her own while dealing with financial hardship and a life that had already been shaped by long-term stress and personal instability. Everything about her situation suggested pressure, and that pressure would later become a key part of how her story was interpreted. What began happening inside that house would eventually become one of the most debated paranormal cases ever recorded. The earliest disturbances were relatively subtle. Doris described objects shifting out of place, doors opening and closing without explanation, and occasional glimpses of human-like shapes that seemed to disappear the moment she tried to focus on them. These figures weren't described as solid, but more like outlines, present enough to notice, but not fully there. At first, the events were unsettling but still easy to dismiss or rationalize. Over time, that changed. According to Doris, the activity became more focused and deliberate, gradually shifting from environmental disturbances to something that felt targeted. She claimed that whatever was inside the house was interacting with her directly. In multiple accounts, she described being physically restrained while lying in bed, unable to move her arms or legs as if they were being held in place. She spoke about pressure against her body and the sensation of being pinned down. She believed there were multiple presences involved, 2 smaller figures and a third that seemed larger and more dominant. These claims would later become the most disturbing part of the case, and also the most controversial, drawing both intense belief and strong skepticism. The case might have remained unknown if not for a chance encounter. In August of 1974, a man named Cary Gaynor was in a bookstore near UCLA discussing his work as a volunteer in a parapsychology lab. The lab, led by Dr. Thelma Moss, was focused on studying unusual phenomenon using a more structured, research-based approach. As Gaynor spoke, Doris approached him and introduced herself. She told him her house was haunted and that the activity had become violent. Gaynor took her information and brought it back to the lab, where he worked with researcher Barry Taft. After hearing the details, Taft agreed to visit the home. When they arrived, their initial reaction was not what Doris had hoped for. The house was in severe disrepair, and the overall environment raised immediate concerns. After listening to her describe the events, especially the more extreme claims, Taft's first impression was that she might be dealing with a psychological issue rather than a paranormal one. They spoke with her briefly, asked questions, and ultimately decided not to pursue the case further at that time. Instead, they recommended that she seek professional help and left the property. About 10 days later, Doris reached out again. This time, her story had changed in a way that was harder to dismiss. She reported that neighbors had begun experiencing similar disturbances in their own homes, strange noises, unexplained movement, and events they couldn't account for. This detail shifted the situation. If the activity was no longer isolated to Doris alone, it suggested something broader might be happening. That was enough to bring the investigators back for a second visit. When they returned, they immediately noticed something unusual that hadn't stood out before. There was a smell in the house that seemed to come and go without warning. When it appeared, it was strong and unmistakable, similar to the odor of something decomposing. The investigators searched for a source, checking under the house, inside the walls, and through the plumbing, but nothing explained it. The smell would simply appear, linger briefly, and then disappear again. It was the middle of summer in California, and the house had no air conditioning. The inside felt hot, heavy, and stagnant. But when Doris led them into her bedroom, the temperature changed instantly. The room felt cold, far colder than it should have been compared to the rest of the house. There was no visible explanation for it. Barry Taft would later describe the sensation as stepping into a completely different environment. According to Doris, this room was where most of the activity occurred, and standing there, the investigators began to reconsider their earlier assumptions. Only a short time later, they witnessed something they could not easily explain. A cabinet door opened on its own, and a frying pan moved out of the cupboard and through the air before hitting the floor. There was no one else in the room and no clear cause. That moment marked the beginning of a full investigation that would continue for several weeks and involve a large number of observers, including students, researchers, and photographers. During that time, the house was rarely empty. At times, more than 20 people were present, attempting to observe and document whatever was happening. Reports continued of objects moving, doors shifting, and sounds echoing through the home. But the most unusual phenomenon described by multiple witnesses involved small, glowing lights. These lights were often described as yellow-green orbs that moved through the rooms in unpredictable ways. They didn't behave like reflections or outside light sources. Instead, they appeared to move with direction, changing speed and path, without any clear pattern. In some cases, investigators believed the lights reacted to people in the room. On one occasion, a researcher spoke aloud and asked the light to move away from the wall, and it appeared to change direction and reposition itself in response. While this was not considered definitive proof of anything, it added to the growing sense that the activity was not random. Attempts were made to photograph the phenomenon, but the results were inconsistent. Instead of capturing clear images, the photographs often showed streaks or arcs of light, which skeptics later attributed to camera exposure issues or movement during the shot. Even so, the people present insisted that what they saw in person did not match what appeared on film. One of the most widely reported moments of the investigation involved the lights gathering together in one area of the room. Multiple witnesses claimed that instead of scattering, the lights seemed to merge, forming the outline of a larger shape. According to those accounts, the shape resembled the upper portion of a human figure. It was described as incomplete and short-lived, appearing briefly before disappearing again. As with many other events in the case, no clear photographic evidence captured what witnesses claimed to have seen. In another incident, Doris indicated that an unseen presence was in the room even though no one else could see it. Investigators attempted to document it using a Polaroid camera. Several photos taken during that moment came out heavily overexposed, showing little to no detail. However, when additional photos were taken moments later after she said the presence was gone, they appeared normal. While this inconsistency raised questions, it did not provide a clear answer. As the investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge. The intensity of the activity appeared to fluctuate, often increasing during periods of emotional stress and decreasing when conditions were calmer. This observation led Barry Taft to consider an alternative explanation. Rather than a traditional haunting, he began to explore the possibility that the events could be the result of psychokinetic activity, something being generated unconsciously by Doris herself. Eventually, Doris moved out of the house. For a short period, the activity seemed to stop, but according to reports, it began again after she relocated. Neighbors in the new area described similar disturbances, even though they were unaware of her past experiences. The investigators visited again and documented additional unexplained events, including objects moving and unusual sounds captured on audio recordings. In one instance, a vase was reportedly thrown across a room during a recording session. When the audio was reviewed later, it appeared to include the sound of footsteps approaching the recording device before abruptly cutting off. As with other elements of the case, the recording raised more questions than answers. Over time, the activity gradually faded. Doris moved again, and eventually the reports stopped altogether. What remained was a case filled with conflicting interpretations. Some believed it represented a genuine paranormal event, supported by the number of witnesses who claimed to have seen unusual phenomena firsthand. Others argued that the case could be explained by psychological factors, environmental conditions, and limitations in how the investigation was conducted. The story would later gain widespread attention after inspiring the book and film The Entity, though those versions took significant creative liberties. Separating documented events from dramatized storytelling became increasingly difficult as the case grew more well known. To this day, there is no single explanation that accounts for everything that was reported. Whether the events were the result of something external, something psychological, or a combination of both remains uncertain. What is clear is that those involved believe they experienced something real, something they could not fully explain, and that uncertainty is what continues to make the case so unsettling. In the winter of the early 1980s, Janet Smurl was alone in the basement of her family's duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston when she heard someone softly call her name.
Janet.
At first, she ignored it. The washing machine had already begun its cycle, filling the basement with that low mechanical rhythm that old houses seem to absorb into their walls. Upstairs, the television played faintly, somewhere in the distance. The rest of the home was empty. Her husband Jack was at work. The children were at school. The house should have been silent. Then the voice came again.
Janet.
This time it was clearer, closer. Janet slowly turned away from the washing machine and stared into the unfinished darkness of the basement. Cardboard boxes sat stacked against the concrete walls. Christmas decorations rested beneath dusty shelves. Weak daylight filtered through the small basement window near the ceiling, illuminating only pieces of the room while leaving the corners swallowed in shadow. There was nobody there. Janet later claimed the voice did not sound distorted or monstrous. If anything, that was what frightened her most. It sounded ordinary. Human. Like someone casually trying to get her attention from another room. She searched the basement anyway. Nothing. Then, just as she reached the staircase, the voice called her name again.
Janet.
This time directly behind her. According to Janet, something about the tone had changed. The voice no longer sounded curious. Now it sounded amused, almost playful. As though whatever was speaking understood she was afraid. Janet later claimed she shouted back into the basement in terror.
What do you want?
The voice never answered. It only whispered her name again.
Janet.
Years later, the Smurl family would say this moment marked a turning point inside the house on Chase Street. Because until then, strange things had happened around the property, but after the voices began, the family no longer believed they were dealing with random noises. They believed something inside the house was listening to them, learning them. And according to the Smurls, over time, the thing inside the home became disturbingly good at sounding human. The Smurl Haunting would eventually become one of the most infamous paranormal cases in American history. The case attracted national media attention throughout the 1980s. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren became heavily involved. Priests reportedly blessed the property multiple times. Skeptics accused the family of exaggeration and mass hysteria. Television crews crowded the street outside the home while reporters documented nearly every new claim emerging from the duplex. But before any of that happened, the Smurls were simply a working-class Pennsylvania family trying to recover from disaster. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes devastated parts of northeastern Pennsylvania. Entire neighborhoods flooded beneath rising water, including the home shared by Jack Smurl's parents, John and Mary Smurl. The family suddenly found themselves displaced. Eventually, John and Mary purchased a duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston. Jack and Janet moved into one side with their children while John and Mary occupied the other. The duplex was old, repairs were constant. The home creaked in the winter and groaned during storms. Like many homes throughout the region, it sat above old mining tunnels that had long since flooded and collapsed beneath the earth. People in West Pittston were used to strange sounds, settling foundations, shifting pipes, banging walls. Everything had an explanation, at least at first. According to the family, the strange activity began gradually after they moved into the duplex during the early 1970s. A dark stain repeatedly appeared on a carpet no matter how many times it was cleaned. Freshly repaired pipes burst unexpectedly. Tools vanished during renovations and later reappeared in impossible places. Then came electrical problems. One evening, Jack reportedly watched his television burst into flames without warning. Other appliances overheated or smoked for no clear reason. Still, none of it felt supernatural. Frustrating maybe, unsettling at times, but explainable. The disturbing incidents began with the children. The Smurl's oldest daughter began waking up terrified during the night. She claimed people were standing inside her bedroom watching her while she slept. Jack repeatedly searched the room and found nothing, but according to the family, the fear in the house slowly deepened over the years. Footsteps echoed upstairs while everyone sat downstairs together. Banging sounds came from inside the walls late at night. Toilets flushed by themselves. Radios turned on unexpectedly at full volume. And eventually, the voices began. According to the Smurl daughters, some of the most disturbing experiences in the house involved hearing family members calling them from isolated parts of the duplex late at night. As the years passed, the Smurl children reportedly became increasingly afraid of certain parts of the duplex, particularly at night. The upstairs hallway, the basement stairs, the rooms furthest away from everyone else. According to the family, the girls began hearing voices calling to them from inside the house after dark. Sometimes the voices sounded exactly like Janet. Soft, patient, calm.
Hey, come here for a second.
Other times the voice sounded like one of their sisters calling from another room. Occasionally, they claimed it sounded like Jack. The voices reportedly always came from somewhere isolated. An empty bedroom, the basement, the far end of the hallway where the lights didn't fully reach. And according to the Smurl daughters, the voices never shouted. They never sounded angry. If anything, they sounded unusually gentle. That was what frightened the family later, because the children often initially believed the voices were real. One of the girls later claimed she heard her mother calling softly from upstairs late one evening.
Can you come here for a minute?
The voice sounded completely normal. The child reportedly began walking toward the hallway before suddenly realizing her mother was downstairs in the kitchen the entire time. Another account described one of the daughters hearing her sister whisper her name repeatedly from inside an empty bedroom. According to the family, when she approached the doorway, the room was dark, silent, empty. The whispering stopped immediately. Janet later claimed the experiences deeply disturbed the children because the voices never sounded threatening enough to ignore. They sounded trustworthy, familiar, like someone they loved wanted their attention. Over time, the family reportedly became convinced that whatever was inside the house understood the routines of the children. It knew their names, it knew their voices, and according to the Smurls, it knew how to imitate both. The Smurl family would later become convinced that whatever was inside the house was deliberately attempting to lure the children into isolated parts of the home away from others. That detail deeply unsettled Janet and Jack. because if the voices had sounded monstrous, the children might have ignored them, but they didn't. They sounded safe. Over time, according to the family, the entity inside the house began imitating more than voices. It began imitating the family itself. Jack's mother, Mary Smurl, later claimed she repeatedly overheard violent arguments coming through the walls separating the two halves of the duplex. She heard Jack screaming at Janet, furniture moving, profanity. At times, the arguments sounded so intense that Mary feared someone inside the home might be hurt. But whenever she confronted them afterward, Janet and Jack appeared calm. No argument had taken place. Nothing inside the home appeared disturbed. According to the family, this happened multiple times. The Smurls later became convinced the entity was mimicking their voices in order to create fear and tension between family members, almost as though it enjoyed turning them against one another. Then there was the dog. The family owned a German Shepherd named Simon. On several occasions, Jack and Janet reportedly heard Simon howling somewhere else in the house late at night. Not barking or growling, but howling in distress. The kind of sound that immediately forces someone to awake in panic. But according to the family, whenever they rushed to investigate, they found Simon asleep beside their bed, undisturbed and silent. By the mid-1980s, the Smurls claimed the activity inside the duplex had escalated dramatically. Janet later reported seeing a black humanoid figure standing inside the kitchen during broad daylight. She described it as human-shaped but made from shifting darkness. Not solid, not transparent, something in between. The figure reportedly moved silently through the room before vanishing. Strangely, Mary Smurl later claimed she had seen a similar black figure independently on the opposite side of the duplex. The descriptions closely matched: a tall, dark shape moving silently through the home, watching, appearing briefly, then disappearing. Around this same time, the family reported a foul odor repeatedly appearing throughout the house. Rotting sewage, decay. The smell often appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. Skeptics would later argue the odor may have been connected to sewer problems in the area, but according to the Smurls, the smell often accompanied other activity inside the house. Knocking, voices, apparitions, as though the odor itself announced the presence of something nearby. One of the most publicized incidents reportedly occurred in 1985. Janet and her daughter were inside the kitchen when a heavy ceiling light fixture suddenly tore free and crashed onto the table beneath them without warning. The family later claimed the damage appeared unnatural, almost as though the fixture had been violently ripped downward. Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured. But according to the Smurls, fear inside the duplex was becoming constant. The family reportedly slept poorly. The children became increasingly afraid of certain rooms. And according to Jack and Janet, the house itself no longer felt random. It felt aware. The voices reportedly appeared most often when someone was isolated. In the basement, in the bathroom, inside bedrooms late at night. Janet later claimed the voice in the basement incident never answered direct questions. It only repeated her name, again and again, as though the goal was not communication, but recognition. As though something inside the house wanted acknowledgement, wanted someone to answer back. By 1986, the Smurl family contacted paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were already nationally famous due to their involvement in other haunting cases, including the Amityville investigation. According to the Warrens, the Smurl duplex contained multiple spirits as well as an inhuman demonic presence feeding on fear inside the home. The Warrens later claimed to have gathered disturbing audio recordings from inside the duplex, including whispering voices, knocking sound, and unexplained disturbances. Ed Warren specifically argued that the entity inside the house used mimicry and psychological manipulation to terrorize the family. Critics strongly disputed these claims. Skeptics, including investigators and psychologists, later argued the events could potentially be explained through stress, suggestion, neurological issues, environmental factors, or outright fabrication. Some critics also argued the Warrens themselves may have intensified the family's interpretation of ordinary events by framing them as demonic attacks. But regardless of the explanation, the fear inside the house became very real for the Smurls. The case soon attracted national media attention. Reporters crowded outside the duplex. Neighbors claimed to hear screaming coming from the property at night. Some allegedly reported hearing disturbances even when the family was away from the home entirely. One particularly disturbing account involved a neighbor reportedly calling the Smurl residence while the family was out of town. According to the story, a young girl answered the phone, laughing softly before abruptly disconnecting the call. No child was supposed to be inside the house. As media attention intensified, the Smurls claimed the activity worsened. Voices, banging, apparitions, whispers from empty rooms. The children continued reporting hearing family members calling to them from isolated parts of the house late at night. And according to the Smurls, the voices always sounded convincing. That was what terrified them the most in the end. Not the shadows, not the smells, not even the apparitions. It was the feeling that something inside the house understood exactly how human beings sounded, exactly how trust worked, exactly how to make someone follow a familiar voice into the dark. Over time, priests blessed the home multiple times. Religious groups gathered there to pray. Eventually, the Smurl family moved away from the duplex entirely. Later residents reportedly claimed they experienced nothing unusual inside the property. And to this day, the Smurl haunting remains deeply controversial. Some believe the family genuinely experienced something terrifying inside the Chase Street duplex. Others believe fear, stress, suggestion, religious belief, environmental conditions, and media pressure created a powerful form of shared psychological reinforcement within the household. But whether the events were supernatural or not, one detail from the case continues to deeply disturb people decades later. According to the Smurl children, the voices never sounded threatening. They sounded familiar. And sometimes, the children almost followed them.